The Canadian music scene has given the world some of the best artists of all time. But in the early days of rock and roll, they didn't get much respect or recognition. This series takes a look at the history of rock and roll in Canada. The pioneers.
We were on a boat in the middle of the English Channel.
The deal makers.
They responded by tearing up my contract.
And the hit makers.
My damn song was on the jukebox.
How did Canada build its star system?
We nicknamed it the Juno Awards.
How were the greats discovered? And who were they?
Not the Stampeders, no.
Yes! HiFi salutes the people who fought to be heard, then rocked our world. These are the untold stories of the Canadian music industry. Welcome to HiFi Salutes. I'm Laurie Brown. Capitol Records Canada was one of the most influential record companies in the 1960s. Paul White, the former vice president and head of A&R at Capitol Records Canada, has made an incredible career of discovering talented artists such as Anne Murray, and was the first record exec in North America to give an unknown band from England a big push. That band was the Beatles. Join us now as HiFi salutes Paul White, one of the pioneers of Canadian rock and roll history.
You can't cover the history of Canadian music without including Paul White. Paul was the executive at Capitol Records of Canada, responsible for launching the careers of Anne Murray, Edward Bear, Robbie Lane, the Staccatos, and many, many more. It was 1957 when Paul White arrived in Toronto from his native England.
In 1957, I was one of those wonderful immigrants. Arrived in Toronto as a cub reporter, thinking I could get a job on the Star or the Telegram at ease. And they told me to go off to Sudbury and other places and learn about the country. And after 2 weeks, I realized that the £50 I brought with me, which is about $150, was running out fast, so I thought I better get a job. I found a shippers wanted at Capitol Records. I didn't know what a shipper was because in England they were called warehouse men. So I went and applied for the job, and there were about 50 or 60 people applying for this $40 a week job. And I got the job simply because I brought references with me. Unfortunately, the next day I forgot where the hell the company was, and I almost lost the job because I was late for the first day. Well, I moved out from the shipping department into the order desk, and when I was there, I started a bowling league with all the other record companies and started a newsletter. Then EMI took over Capitol Records, and the manager said, we have to get some more staff, so get that Englishman and put him in promotion, he can write. And that's how I got started.
One of Paul White's innovations at Capitol Records was the sizzle sheet, which promoted the latest 45 singles to Canadian radio and retail record stores.
45s were the big thing, so I had to write the blurbs for every release we had. And then I started to write the sizzle sheet about all Capitol singles. And then I expanded it when I became promotion manager to all Capitol Records. It was so fragmented in Canada that you could have a hit record by a Canadian in Montreal and it would sell very well, but it wouldn't go on any charts anywhere else in the country. And my first breakthrough with that was Barry Allen from Edmonton with Love Drops, which I actually managed to get on coast-to-coast stations. With Barry Allen, we actually sold 40,000 singles, which was very big for 1965.
In the early 1960s, one of the biggest sellers for Capitol Canada was the singer known as Britain's answer to Elvis Presley.
Cliff Richard was such a big star in Canada. He didn't make it in the States, but here I could have released an album a week by Cliff Richard and we'd sell 50,000 copies.
Another Paul White creation was the Capitol 6000 album series, which he originally used to release the back catalog from Capitol's British parent company, EMI. That series quickly expanded to include US and Canadian albums. In early 1963, Paul discovered an exciting new sound from England on a 45 single he'd received from EMI.
the Beatles. When everybody used to go home from work, I used to sit and listen to all the samples that EMI sent. And I would literally have 50 45s to listen to. And when the Beatles Let Me Do, I put it on the turntable, they were so bright and different from everything I was listening to, I put them on the I'll think about it pile. And then I thought about it just a little longer and decided to release it. And for my efforts, it sold 78 copies. So I decided I might as well go with another one just to see if I was an idiot. And I sold 180 copies of Please Please Me. And then it kept rolling, and by the time She Loves You came along, Beatlemania was rolling right across the country. It was an amazing time.
By taking a chance on the then unknown British pop group, Paul White beat Capital US Beatles releases by nearly a year. The Beatles had million-selling hit after million-selling hit and could seemingly do no wrong. That is until 1966, when the group wanted a controversial cover for their Yesterday and Today album that became known as the Butcher cover.
Well, the Butcher cover is, again, believe what you want these days. None really got out. I've been told that they even got out to Sam the Record Man and were on sale in the store. Well, they never were. I was so smart, I had access to the whole thing before they were destroyed, and I took 3 copies. I must admit I sold them off at a profit. The Beatle covers were actually pasted over, and of course then they put on that rather boring replacement.
For his continuing successes, Capitol Records promoted Paul to Director of Artists and Repertoire, or A&R for short, although he continued to handle national promotions for a time. Thanks to steady sales from the British acts, Paul began to sign up-and-coming Canadian artists, although initially he didn't get a lot of support from his sales team.
I got lucky. I had Jerry and the Pacemakers, Billy J. Kramer. Dave Clark was huge. But I'd say that most of the English Invasion easily sold 50,000 albums every time we released them. And that was part of my problem with Canadian talent, is because our salespeople were having so much fun just walking into record stores and taking orders for the Beatles and the British Invasion, that when I tried to get them to promote Canadian artists, it was too much trouble for a lot of them. So the Beatles were good for us from the point of view that they gave me the money to go out and sign Canadian artists, but I was having flack from my own people. But once they caught on that you could actually sell Canadian artists, they came on board. The Esquires were the first group I signed, and that got me in with the group of people from Ottawa. And so that's when I eventually signed the Staccatos and had a pretty good hit with Half Past Midnight. And I was able to sort of start branching out across the country.
By the late 1960s, Paul was one extremely busy executive.
When I was first in A&R, I didn't have a budget to go traveling around the country. So I would watch CBC shows and see who was doing well.
Paul White saw us, I don't know if he remembers this, but he saw us on a TV show. We ended up doing a CBC TV show. And as opposed to actually coming to see us, he saw the show and, oh yeah, that's the band that keeps bugging me. So they ended up signing us.
Frankly, that's how I found Anne Murray. She was on Sing Along Jubilee. I just fell in love with her. Anne signed with Art to do an album produced by Brian O'Hearn, and they sold their albums for $1.98. I wanted to sign her badly, and so I phoned Brian O'Hearn, and he said, oh yeah, we'll come and see you. And I found that by the time he came to see me, he'd already been to RCA and Warner Brothers on the way around to see me. So he and Anne came in with Bill Langstroth, who was her manager then, and I said, I'll give you $18,000 to do an album. I can still see the look on their faces when I mentioned that money. And when you think about it, that album went on to sell millions, and it cost $18,000.
Anne Murray sold millions of albums and singles for Capitol Records. Paul still gets chills when he thinks about the recording session for Anne's biggest hit, 1978's You Needed Me.
Of all my career in the music business, that is the one thing that stands out and will always stand out in my mind. When Jim Ed Norman was the producer, and we recorded at Eastern Sound, we're going to do the strings for You Needed Me. We had the big speakers, of course, up in front of us, and Anne and I were literally standing side by side. And when the strings went on, the shivers went through everybody's body in the studio. It was one of those magical moments in the music industry that's what you're there for.
Other acts Paul White signed to Capitol Canada included Wes Dacus and the Rebels, Robbie Lane and the Disciples, and a Toronto area group called Jack London and the Sparrows.
When he had If You Don't Want My Love as the first single, we took him along the Battle of the Bands, and the band he was going to be battling with was the Yardbirds, who I also had on Capitol. There was this huge crowd. It was just going down the street. I mean, teenagers all over the place. And I naturally thought they were there for the Yardbirds. When I got inside, I found they were there for Jack London. And when he showed up, and he always wore a great big fur coat, they just went gaga. And we had to really literally pull him into the station. And the Yardbirds were not too happy about it.
The Sugar Shop, featuring future actor Victor Garber, was another successful Paul White signing. Paul remembers the time he brought the group to perform at a Capitol Records convention in Las Vegas.
On that bill was Cannonball Adderley, Woody Allen, who had signed a contract with Capitol, Linda Ronstadt, Glenn Campbell, and the Sugar Shop. And the Sugar Shop blew the crowd away. They were absolutely amazing to see. On stage, they were marvelous. But Pete Mann didn't really want to be a big star. If you talk to Vic Garber now, of course, he just laughs at that time because he's gone on to the Titanic and other things. But that was a great time with the Sugar Shop.
In 1978, after 21 years at Capitol Canada, Paul joined Anne Murray's management company. He was there for 2 years, then left to launch Cephal Records. After a year, Paul quit and started a freelance publicity company. He was then hired by BMG Music, where he produced a number of compilations, including a set of CDs featuring Canadian artists.
I went to BMG with the project, which became Made in Canada. It ended up as a 4-CD set. One of my proudest achievements, actually, because I wanted to put things that you can't find so much. And that was a joy to do.
Paul White retired in 1994, but continued to work on projects that interested him. Looking back on his incredible journey through the Canadian music industry, Paul says,
"It's been fun. It's been a lot of fun."
Coming up after this short break, HiFi salutes one of Paul White's proteges, Larry Evoy, a.k.a. Edward Bear.
It's just your masquerade, making you the queen of diamonds, honey. I'm the ace of spades.
The legacy of Capitol Records is a large one, but Paul White in particular has always had a knack for picking out the diamonds in the rough. And that was exactly what he did one night while sitting at home watching a television show. It was that night that he discovered Larry Evoy, whose biggest hit, Last Song, went on to #1 in Canada and peaked at #3 on the US Billboard charts. Join us now and find out how Paul White and Winnie the Pooh helped give Canada another rock and roll legend in Larry Evoy as Edward Bear, as HiFi Salutes continues.
During the late 1960s and early 70s, one of the most consistently successful bands on the Canadian music scene was Edward Bear. Hit after hit played on the radio and flew out of the record stores. Although the best-known lineup for the band was as a trio, Edward Bear's lead singer Larry Evoy says it didn't start out that way.
It was a 5-piece band originally, and then it kept switching with me playing drums because I wanted to be a singer. I just want to stand up and be a singer. And then we'd lose the drummer because drummers are notoriously flaky, even though I'm a drummer. And then I'd play drums, and then finally it got to the point where the bass player left. We had seen the Doors, and we realized that, you know, a good keyboard player can play bass with his left hand. And Paul was a good keyboard player, so he could do that. And that's what we did, ended up a 3-piece band.
Now that they had a band, they still needed a name.
Somebody had given me the book on Winnie the Pooh, and that's the first page. Here comes Edward Bear bumping down the stairs. And we were just trying to get a name. And like idiots, we called it the Edward Bear Review as a joke, because there were so many R&B bands then, and we were not an R&B band. And we got booked at the Club 888, I think it was called. People flicked cigarettes at us. It was like horrible. It was just a bad idea. So we changed it to just Edward Bear.
It was Capitol Records of Canada executive Paul White who signed Edward Bear to the label, but not before Larry checked out a book on how the music business really worked.
I read This Business of Music, which was a music book, just before we signed with Capitol, and figured out, really? You just read the book? Oh, that's how it works. Capitol was being pitched, you know, constantly trying to, oh, you know, you got to sign this band, this is a good band. We had somebody working for us as a sort of a manager and trying to get hold of them. And then finally, I think Paul White saw us, I don't know if he remembers this, but he saw us on a TV show. We ended up doing a CBC TV show. And as opposed to actually coming to see us, he saw the show and went, oh yeah, that's the band that keeps bugging me. So they ended up signing us, which was great.
The live Edward Bear sound was much harder than most of their records, and so early on in their career, they were invited to be the opening act for Led Zeppelin at the Rock Pile in downtown Toronto.
I mean, it was exciting, mostly because I can't remember which one it was, but they refused to go on because Rockpile was withholding tax. And some idiot in the audience stole the distributor cap off their truck, their rented truck. So as a roadie was loading their truck, like he's saying, okay, I'm putting all this away. One guy doing everything for Zeppelin. And then found that they'd stolen the cap. They worked out a deal, but the new deal was, we don't go on until the distributor cap comes back. It comes flying up from the audience. Some guy throws it back to Edward Bear as a band started just doing covers of everybody's stuff, and then slowly started writing. And the first album was really good because sometimes we'd be rehearsing and I'd bring in lyrics and a melody, and they'd be jamming something. Danny and Paul would be playing something that actually perfectly suited it. So it would all fit together, you know. It was kind of like a perfect collaboration where you don't even have to think about it. It just is already there. It just worked really well.
In 1970, Capitol Records released the Edward Bear debut album, Bearings. Right out of the gate, the Boys and the Bear had themselves a hit.
It worked for whatever reason. Certainly the early Bear, we were a heavier band. I mean, you can't open for Led Zeppelin unless you're sort of heavier. You, Me in Mexico was a bit of a, it was just strange because it was a single for sure, you know. And Capitol was real excited about that because that's what record companies did. They wanted a single from an album, no matter who you were.
In fact, they were the first group that I actually released an album without a single first. We were sitting around and we said, well, we should put something on here that could be a single. And so Larry played us all the stuff he had. And we said, no, there's still not anything here. And he said, oh, as a matter of fact, I do have a tape that I wrote yesterday. So he took out this little cassette, and You, Me in Mexico was the tune.
But then what changed it completely was adding all the sweetening. You know, when you do something like add trumpets and marimba and everything, that because it was Mexico, you know, it all made sense. But it just completely changed it. I liked it. I thought, wow, that's really impressive. Well, look what they did with that.
So we said, oh, thanks, Larry. I think that's our next single.
Once Edward Bear hit the charts, they then hit the road.
We had some horrible tours. the promoters in Calgary had our bus seized by the sheriff because we wouldn't do one of the gigs they wanted us to do, and those are good times, you know. And we didn't do a ton in the U.S. We just did mostly, and there you go. Because of singles, you end up doing theme parks. You know, you do Six Flags Over Texas, you do Disneyland, and I love those kind of gigs. They're really fun. You know, they give you free tickets. Did you know that? You can actually go on the rides. It's really, yeah. And you go backstage and see everything. It's really good.
Edward Bear's follow-up hit to You, Me in Mexico was Fly Across the Sea. The inspiration for that song came from Larry's own family.
That was my great aunt. I can't remember the sequence of why I was thinking about her, because my grandparents had said to me, you know, she's still over there and she's not doing well, and you know, and I started feeling badly, thinking this is really stupid, somebody I've never even met and I should know, and there's this history of, and you know, I'm thinking, oh, and I could go over there and this could be all, and then she died, like before I could even, you know, so that was the song.
Masquerade was the next Edward Bear song to climb the singles chart.
That same girl I'd written so many songs about. Last song, I mean, on and on. There's like 10 songs I think I wrote about her. And that was the same thing. Our guitar player at the time, Roger, just didn't have a lead for it. He just couldn't get a lead. You know, he just didn't have it in his brain. And Terry Brown said, there's no problem, man. I'll get, you know, and he gets Terry Bush in, who was a session guy. And he just sat down and listened to it once, I swear, listened to it once, and then played that lead. Killer lead, like, you know, makes the song what it is. And then he stops and everybody's like, huh? And then he said, do you want me to double that? Which he actually did too, like play it all the same, again, exactly the same, note for note. I mean, come on, who can do that, right?
Then, in 1973, Edward Bear struck the mother lode with another Larry Evoy-written hit. Last Song went to #3 on the U.S. singles chart. In Canada, it was a #1 smash.
I knew, actually, when I finished writing it, that it was a really good song, like a really special song. There was something magical about it, you know? I think it took Capitol a while after it was finished. Finally, I remember Paul was going, okay, yeah, this would be a single, but me always believing that it would be a really, really strong, big song, and it was.
This is the last song I'll ever sing for you. You come looking for the light, and it won't be there, but I love you.
After 4 years of hit after hit after hit, Edward Bear's hits stopped. Why is still a mystery.
Maybe you just have a time, you know, like a window for everything, and that was the window for the band or for those songs, or I don't know, just faded away.
So what happened to Larry Evoy after the Bear?
I did a whole bunch of stuff, took Second City classes, just trying different things. The last thing I did was in 2000, they had a big music thing in Ottawa. They got all the old guys, the singers from a lot of the old bands like Lighthouse and Stampeders, and Ian Thomas was there, and me, and that was probably my dream gig. The backup band was killer good. They played the song, or the clip of the song. You'd do like 40 seconds of your song. They were so exactly accurate. So you get to come on, do 40 seconds of your song, and go off. And it was like, yes, this is my kind of gig. The best part about that gig, that was in 2000, was my kids were still young enough. They had never seen me perform. And so they were in front. And what stunned them was people were singing along to Last Song, like all the people in the audience. There was a big, like 100,000 people, and they're singing along to Last Song, and they're kind of going, gee, Dad can actually do something, you know?
In 1978, Larry Evoy released a solo album on Attic Records. For many years, he's also been raising award-winning horses. During the past 3 years, Larry's been recording other artists in his home studio. He continues to hear Edward Bear songs wherever he goes.
It still is surreal. I mean, I'll still be in a store and I'll hear, whoa, that's me. Like the voice is familiar, you know, what is that? And it'd be Masquerade or something. It's just unusual to hear. It's a very weird thing where you've done something and created something, and now it's where you'd hoped it would be, but you can actually hear it there. It's pretty neat.
Capitol Records Canada Vice President Paul White truly had an eye and ear for talent. In a time when Canadian records were being thrown out at radio stations across the country, Capitol Records Canada promoted and nurtured the talent from north of the border. It was with the help of these record labels that Canadian talent could be heard around the world. For more information about the series, please see the link below. I'm Laurie Brown. Thanks for watching.